David Stevens creates family-friendly one-person puppet shows that he tours all across the United States. His shows have been awarded Jim Henson Foundation grants and UNIMA citations. I talked to David about his career, including his stint on Sesame Street, on this episode of Under the Puppet.
You're listening to Saturday Morning Media. And now, back to our show.
Welcome to the show that talks to puppeteers about the art and business of puppetry. My name is Grandpa Choco, and this is Under the Puppet. Welcome to Under the Puppet. This episode, my guest is David Stevens. David played Shade's Wolf on the television show SeeMore's Playhouse, and he did some time on Sesame Street. But it's David's work with his own company, All Hands Productions, creating and touring family-friendly one-person puppet shows that has garnered him acclaim all across the country. Here now is my interview with David Stevens. Well, David Stevens, welcome to Under the Puppet.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Grant. This is a real treat.
Well, I'm super excited to talk to you. I first saw you perform at, I knew about you and heard about you, but saw you perform at the National Festival in 2019 and was just blown away. So I'm super excited to get to talk to you today.
Oh, well, thank you. That was, those are some fun shows at that festival. The Pie Picker, it still feels like a new show to me, even though it's a couple of years old now, but it's still a lot of fun to do.
We're going to talk about all that, but I would like to start with the question I usually start with. Do you remember your first exposure to puppetry as a child?
For me, I guess, like a lot of people, the clearest version I have is the Muppets and Sesame Street. I know that I had contact with puppets when I was in preschool. There was a teacher, not my teacher, there was a teacher in an adjacent classroom that had, I think she had a Cookie Monster and a Hairy Monster from those Sesame Street toy line. And I remember playing with those. And I had some puppets of my own as a kid. But those are kind of my earliest memories of like being exposed to puppets. And certainly, television, the Muppets.
Right. Well, and there's a picture on your website of you at age 7 with some puppets.
Yes.
Was that after you got into it, or those were just puppets that you had as a kid?
Those were puppets I had as a kid. One of them was a store-bought dog glove puppet that an aunt of mine sent me. And the lion that's in that photo, if I'm thinking about the same one, that was actually made by a next-door neighbor of mine. And I puppets were kind of always around, but the interest was certainly there early on. And she made that puppet for me because she knew I liked puppets. And it was kind of, she was actually the lady that taught me how to sew later on when I was a teenager. And but that was like one of my very early puppets, and she made that for me. Wow.
And growing up, were your parents creative?
So my dad is a pastor, and then my mother raised me. She played a little piano. She sang. She had a trained voice. And she, of any of us, she had some creative tendencies. Most of that impulse came, I think, from my dad's mother. She was the sort of crafty, creative one. She was also a brilliant seamstress. So I definitely inherited the gene, but I think it was from a generation above my parents.
Got it. And on your website, it says that you started building in junior high school. And I know you mentioned your neighbor taught you to sew, but what resources did you use to figure out how to even build a puppet to start with?
I had a couple of pretty simple Puppet Productions puppets. Puppet Productions was a company, I think they were out of California for a while and then moved to Texas, but they were a resource for puppet ministry, puppet troops, and they sold puppets and scripts and whatnot. And I had a couple of their puppets. And Elsie Lipscomb was my neighbor, and I took one of these over to her house, and we didn't take it apart, but we sort of figured out on top of it how to make the pattern, and we just sort of flubbed our way through it and had some pretty basic puppets. And they weren't made out of foam; they were simply fabric made and then stuffed with fiber fill. So they weren't necessarily the most comfortable on the inside, but they got the job done, and that's kind of how we figured out, how the mouth fits into things and the fabric on top and all that stuff. So it was pretty, fly by the seat of our pants, because we didn't, at that time, there were no pattern resources. Now there's a ton of stuff just with the internet and social media, but there wasn't any of those resources at the time. So we really had to figure it out.
Right. Do you still have some of those early puppets?
Oh, I have all of those.
Yeah.
The ones that she made especially. Those are really sentimental to me, and I will always have those as long as I'm able to have those. The ones that I made after I took over, Miss Elsie made puppets for me for about a year, and then I commandeered my mother's sewing machine and I broke so many needles trying to sew fur. But a lot of those have gone on to that great puppet heap in the sky. Because they were rough. They were so rough. But, that's how you learn. You make a lot of stuff that doesn't look so good until you finally figure it out, and then you start to make some stuff that looks a little better. So I have some of those that were special to me, but like I said, a lot of those were merely exercises in the process of trying to take a concept that I imagined and realize it in 3 dimension. I think that's one thing that's sort of hard to really grasp, is figuring out I have this idea and I want to see it as a puppet, and getting that transference is a process.
Yeah, that is something. I mean, even I tried dabbling in puppet building for a very short time, but I could not grasp my head around. Wait, this flat thing has become a round thing. I couldn't
Exactly.
I couldn't see that. It was very difficult to grab onto.
I wish I had a better grasp of mathematics and geometry, because that's really what that is, and I have managed to be as pretty decent with just eyeballing things, and I still work with patterns and everything, but they're certainly not. I wouldn't call them draftsman quality from somebody that kind of understands the math and the physics behind all of that, taking a flat thing and making it a shaped thing.
Yeah. Well, a lot of your shows and the projects that you've worked on involve you singing and are very musical. And you mentioned your mom was musical. Did you take any singing lessons growing up, or did just singing come naturally?
Singing sort of came naturally. Growing up in church, there was a children's choir that I was part of, and then when I got older, I was singing in the adult choir. So singing was kind of always around. I didn't really, like I said, my mother played a little piano, but just sort of rudimentary to get through if the regular pianist couldn't play that Sunday. But there weren't any other musicians in the family. I'm told that my great grandfather played fiddle. At least he could eke through Sally Gooden, but I never heard him. He was long gone by the time I came along. But so there was nobody else who played musical instruments. That sort of came on later when I was sort of at the end of high school. But music, certainly singing, was always around in church. And then I think just the influence of the Muppets, too. I don't think that can be underestimated, too. That was kind of my musical education, because the scope of what they covered in musical genre was kind of all over the map, from, country and western and kind of bluegrassy folk stuff to rock music and operetta and everything else in between. I mean, it's kind of covers that broad spectrum. And I think that was kind of my school for music appreciation.
Yeah, it was sort of like a jukebox. You never knew what you were going to get.
Absolutely, and so invaluable, too. Later on, I got to know Jerry Nelson pretty well, and he and I would have conversations about that. I was in the process of digitizing some of my albums, and as I was doing that, I'd send him an MP3 of something and that I thought he might like, and he would comment and say, he'd actually seen that group. Like there was a harmonica band, and I sent him a track of that. He said, I saw them when they were in D.C. one time. And it was really great to sort of trade those stories about these oddball musicians that were kind of all over the place at that time.
Yeah. Well, now, when you were 14, your parents took you to the Center for Puppetry Arts in Atlanta to, as you said, feed your puppetry obsession. Yeah. It seems that your parents were very supportive of this passion for puppetry.
Absolutely. Could not be more so. Before I was old enough to drive, my dad would take me to puppet festivals. He would at the time, the Alabama Puppetry Guild was around, and he would take me to guild meetings in Mobile. And he would take me to shows before I was able to drive myself to get to shows. I tried to use him sometimes. That poor man, he had to endure a pretty I could be a pretty irate director if I didn't get what I wanted when I was a teenager. And he sort of endured that with Grace until I figured sort of how to do it out by myself. But yeah, no, they were great. Like I said, Dad would go with me to festivals. I think there were at least 3 or 4 festivals we went to together. And yeah, I think once I started to be able to make a little money at it, my mother was a little more convinced than she might have been at the beginning. But she also was kind of a little perturbed by the sheer quantity of puppets I was turning out at the time, because, you know, I was a non-social kid, so I just stayed in my room and made puppets all the time. And this building mountain of things was sort of taking up a lot of space. And so I think she understands now that it was about the process of learning how to do something and not just trying to amass a quantity of things. But no, they've both been very, very supportive and big cheerleaders for me.
Well, can you tell us a bit about that first trip to the Center for Puppetry Arts?
Oh, well, there's sort of 2 stories. The first story, the very first time we went, it was closed. We had driven from Birmingham. So where I grew up was South Alabama. So Alabama has that little tail at the end of it between Louisiana and Florida. Mobile is near the Louisiana side, and I grew up on the side closest to the panhandle of Florida in Baldwin County. And so the center from there is about 5 hours. So trips to Atlanta were not regular. But from Birmingham, it's only about 2.5 hours. So we were visiting my grandparents in Birmingham and decided to take the trip over to Atlanta. And I guess we just didn't call, or we just assumed they'd be open. And we got there and they were closed. Something had happened to the museum's air conditioning unit. And the museum was closed, and that was the reason we'd gone, because they had Strange Pork and Link from Pigs in Space on display, as well as some other Muppet stuff, and that's what I was dying to see, was Muppets up close. And so I think I was 13 or 14 at the time, and I just sat in the car and cried. I was just like a blubbery mess because I couldn't get in the center. And my dad, bless his heart, he tried. He begged and pleaded with whoever he could talk to on the intercom system into the building, and they didn't know who we were nobodies. We were just people, and but it didn't work. And so I think we planned it again. I can't remember how much time had gone by, and then we went again when it was open, and we did check, and we saw the exhibit at the time, which was great. This was at a time when they had one of the Mystics, and it was open, like it was open air, like it wasn't covered in anything. And it was crazy at the time to see this thing. You could walk around it sort of 360, and it was great. They had one of Bruce Schwartz's puppets. They just had a phenomenal global collection at the time. And we did see a show. I want to say the show that we saw the first time I went was Pecos Bill. And I think it was a visiting company, as I recall. But it was a big, it was like going to Mecca for a kid that was wanted to be around puppets and see puppets, and it really fed my soul. And I think it was the second time we went that they were open that I met Terry Snyder, or I saw Terry. And Terry would end up becoming my mentor for about 20 years. And he sort of revolutionized how I saw being a solo puppeteer. So the center was very, very integral to my early sort of figuring out how to do this.
Well, and you have gone on to puppeteer at the center as well, right?
Yeah, I interned there when I was a college. I think I was a sophomore, junior. I interned there for a summer, and Bobby Box, who recently passed away, sadly, he was my intern coordinator while I was there. And it was kind of interesting because normally they would do production interns where you would come in for a show and be the production intern for whatever show they happen to be producing. You were either a production intern or you were an administrative intern. And those they would sort of get from Georgia State. They would get some of their MBA folks to come and intern in the admin department there. So they didn't have much in the summertime because at the center, the summer was always reserved for guest artists. And so it was kind of weird that they would have an intern during that time that I was there. But it meant that I got to sort of go around to all departments. So I worked, some days I would stuff mailers in the marketing department, and some days I would be building puppets for Winnie the Pooh in production, and some days I would be, doing stuff with the museum. At the time, they were mounting an exhibit of Jimmy Rowland's stuff, and so I was helping with some of that. So I got to a real broad experience working interdepartmentally there that a lot of interns didn't really necessarily get that experience. And then I started performing there, I think in '98. I think I was doing little shows for their fundraiser events, like String Fling, which is their big fundraiser event every year. And then I started performing there more frequently, on the regular in about 2002. I think that was the first season I did a real legitimate run at the center.
Was it sort of like this great feeling of accomplishment to get to perform at this place you idolized so much as a youngster?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd seen Terry there. I saw Drew Allison from Gray Seal Puppets there. I'd seen Paul Vincent Davis, brilliant hand puppeteer from Boston, Massachusetts there. I mean, I'd seen all of these wonderful performers, and here I was sort of on that stage too. It was a big deal because I always thought, and I still do, that you have to be of a certain quality to warrant being on that stage. And it was nice that I was allowed to be there.
Yeah. Well, you've mentioned Terry a couple times, and I know he's very important to you. Can you talk about the first time you met Terry Snyder?
Well, like I said, the first time I saw his show was at the center. He did a production of Velveteen Rabbit. That was a one-man show. And both of my parents, normally my dad and I would do puppet stuff together. It was more cost-effective for two of us to do some stuff than all three of us. But this particular time, Mom happened to be with us too. And we went to see Terry's show. And this was right after Jim had died, maybe about a year after Jim Henson had died, which was a huge deal for me. It was a major loss in my life, like it was for a lot of us, I think. And so when Terry came out on stage, he was this tall, very skinny, bearded, long-haired guy, and we all just kind of did a double take to each other going like, what? And then he did his show, and after the show was over, there were tears down all three of our faces. He was such a great performer. Terry knew how to perform with such gentle strength. And that really was him as much as it was his shows, and because his shows were really an extension of him. I met him after that. He sort of achieved celebrity status in our family. He was instantly revered to the point where Dad mentioned him in his sermon that Sunday. It's like, that was big kudos. So I met him the next year at a regional Puppeteers of America festival that was in Asheville. Oh, no, it was in Charleston. This was in Charleston. And that was the first one I went to. And Terry came in. We were at the registration place. We were, getting registered and everything. And in walked Terry Snyder. And I was like, Dad, that's Terry Snyder. Terry Snyder's here. And he did his Beatrix Potter show. And I was a total fanboy. I went up to and asked for his autograph. And he obliged. And he thought I was being very silly. And 2 years later, he was at another regional, and he sort of flippantly said at that first regional where I met him, he said, well, if you're ever in Richmond, come on over to the studio, ha, ha, ha. And so when I saw him 2 years later, I said, do you remember when you said I could come to can I still come to your studio? And he sort of looked at me, he's like, yeah, kid, sure. And 2 weeks later, I was on a plane. And he and his wife Linda both graciously in time adopted me. I mean, they were really like adoptive parents to me. And every summer I would spend a week in Richmond just learning and absorbing Terry's knowledge and his stories. And it was just amazing to have a nurturing relationship with a professional who was willing to take the time to impart his wisdom onto me. And that was exceedingly special. I think any of the arts, or just in life in general, I think a mentorship is such an invaluable relationship to have. Not for the networking and all of that stuff, but just for the relationship that you build with somebody who knows what they're talking about. It was just really invaluable to me. And he was such a special part of my life in so many ways. That puppetry, it was all an outgrowth of our connection through puppetry.
Right. It's funny, you answered exactly the question I was going to ask was, is it important to seek out a mentor? So I was like, okay, I got to skip. I don't ask that question.
Well, there's so many ways now. I mean, for the longest time, there were two ways. You could either figure it out yourself or you found somebody who could teach you or, steal from. But now there's just so many more resources that are just readily available. It's kind of amazing. And all of it's valid, every single bit is valid. I appreciate my own experience just because I know the efforts I had to go to get the information I wanted, that it wasn't just a click away. There was a real time delay.
Yeah.
And it was a building up of skills. It's amazing now that you can buy a ready-made pattern and your first attempt, if you're diligent and careful about it, your first attempt at making something can be pretty good. Whereas I know there were at least 100 yucky things that I made before I felt like any of them were good. But, that's the way it goes. So,
well, let me ask you this. Yeah, let me ask you this. Terry was very open with you and showing his workshop and sort of his process. Do you think it's worthwhile for puppeteers, like even nowadays, to share their process with the world?
That's a tricky question. I think it depends on I tend to be of a more protective nature. That doesn't mean I'm against giving out the information that I have or any of that stuff. But I think Terry was open to me because he knew I was serious about it. And I don't think he was that prejudicial about not giving his information to just anybody. I think if anybody asked him, he would tell them anything about his process and about his work. I don't know. That's a tough question. I think in knowing puppet history, there was certainly a time when puppeteers had the same attitude as magicians, where it was a closed society. These were our secrets, and nobody is privy to them, and these are mine. Until Tony Stark came along, and he sort of ripped that all apart and said, here's everything, and here's how you do it. I don't know. I sort of fall somewhere in between.
Yeah.
I don't give out patterns. I don't give out free stuff like that. I don't know. It's great if you can, and if that's your inclination, more power to you. I think that's great. But I don't know. I fall somewhere in between that line. I'm willing to show somebody if they want to come and watch or, try something out, or if they want to bring something to me and we can sort of figure it out, or if they're having trouble with something, I'm glad to do any of that. But just strictly putting information out there because I know it, I don't know. I'm a little more reserved about that. We're in a time of where live streaming seems to be a real hot topic right now, and people are sort of putting a lot of work out there. I have a real value of intellectual property. It's kind of all I have. I don't have a whole lot of assets outside of that world. But the shows that I come up with are definitely things that I work very hard to produce, and I've worked very hard to sort of maintain a business where that's the commodity, if
right.
you will.
Yeah.
So I still place a value on that. I still place and I don't think it diminishes just because the market does weird things or there's or because I don't know. In live shows, it's a little different because the market's real strange because you have folks that just want to do live performances for the sake of doing them because they have a love of children or they're retired and they have the time and they're willing to do a show for free or for next to free, which sort of really saturates the market with people like me, for people like me who are trying to make a living doing this. and it becomes difficult to sort of say, no, this has value, like this has a real worth to it. Not to say that theirs doesn't, but what I charge is kind of worth what I charge.
Right.
Yeah. That's a long-winded answer and a kind of rambly one at best, but I sort of fall between giving it away and not giving it out at all.
No, I totally understand. And I know, like, at the festival after your show, you invited people up to check out your stage and to see the puppets. But that was also, that's not, like, you're not doing that show out in the middle of the mall or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, this is a festival with puppeteers, so you're sharing the knowledge there, so people can check out what you're doing. And so I totally understand that difference.
Absolutely. And with an audience of puppeteers, that's kind of standard at a festival, for either the audience of puppeteers to come up and walk around or ask questions or whatever. And in that environment, it's one thing. Normally at a live show, if I'm at a library or a school or whatever, there'll usually be one kid. There'll be one or two kids that try to sneak backstage, or they'll come up with a parent because they're too shy or whatever, and the parent will ask the question. And I find that a lot of times it's those kids that come up and they have really, really insightfully good questions about how I did something, or they just something they want to know or they want to see. And of course you take the time for that because you're fostering somebody's imagination, their creative mind.
Right.
You're planting a little seed there. So that's important stuff.
Yeah, they could have a pile of 100 puppets at home that they've been building and want to know how it's done.
Well, I did a show one time, and afterwards I had to make a run to the craft store to pick something up, and there was a mom with her two boys in one of the aisles, and she stopped me and she said, "We loved your show. They had to come here and they wanted to buy puppet making stuff." I'm like, "Oh no! Oh, I'm sorry." If you feel like a drug pusher.
The first puppet's free.
That's right. There goes all your money.
Well, in 2001, you got a Master's in Puppet Arts from UConn. And, actually on this show, we have not talked about the University of Connecticut much. And can you tell us a bit about the university and their puppetry program?
I was there the last year. They were in the basement of Sprague. For the longest time, they were in the basement of the boys' dormitory in Sprague Hall. And if you can imagine, that was where the boiler room was. So you would wear 10 layers of clothes to walk from your dorm to the puppet lab, and then you would have, shorts and a T-shirt on during December while you were in the puppet lab. It was just kind of, one extreme to the other, because you'd have snow piled up 6 inches high outside, and then you felt like you were in a roaster when you were in the puppet lab. And then the next year they had moved the entire works over to the Depot campus. I did a master's program. The MFA is a 3-year program, and the MA program is a 2-year program, which is strictly coursework. There were 3 to 4 I think there were 4 classes each semester that were puppet related, and they centered around a different style. So you'd have a rod puppet class, a hand puppet class, shadows. There was an isms class, which was about different sort of movements in puppet theater. There was there were just a broad plethora. I did the coursework in 3 semesters. The last semester, I think, was a television class, a blacklight puppetry class, and then I think maybe a marionette class, if I'm not mistaken. I did part of a marionette class. It was broken up into 2 segments. So I did my coursework in 3 semesters and graduated early, mostly because I was chomping at the bit. I kind of knew what I wanted to do on the other side. I knew that I wanted the coursework to sort of complement and add to the information and knowledge that I already had, because I knew I wanted to be a live solo puppeteer like Terry. I mean, he was my model, because I had all of this inspiration that I was going to go back to the South and Alabama and spread the gospel of puppetry, and which ended up taking me to Atlanta. And that was certainly, because I had realistic, pragmatic ideas about making a living at this. At the time, Muppets was not hiring anybody. I was kind of specifically told by a builder that I had some strikes against me because I wasn't what they were looking for. And so I never even gave it much thought as far as like trying to break into the industry side of things. So the goal for me was to just gain some more information and meet some people who were also interested in doing this, who were of my peer group, and then going back to the South to start a touring company, which is kind of what I did. It was great to have a concentrated time to sort of work on things. I developed Billy Goat Scruff and Other Stuff, which turned into be one of my first successful touring shows while I was a student there. And that was definitely a good benefit. But yeah, if I had to say what the most valuable thing I got out of my University of Connecticut experience, I'll tell you what it is. It was the glove puppet pattern that Michael Graham developed. And Paul Vincent Davis did come in one day, and he sort of did a demonstration of glove puppetry, which was phenomenal. But yeah, just getting this very simple method of making a glove puppet pattern has been so valuable to me. So there were a lot of good things about it, but that certainly was one of them. Just the access to information and the concentrated time to push some boundaries, to get me out of thinking necessarily in a Muppet mindset, and to have these assignments where you would have to develop a short piece of puppet work that you had to present in class. I mean, that was a real challenge too, in getting your gears turning. As far as like, we made a thing and now we have to perform with this thing, and it was kind of like developing a slam piece. They were 3 to 5 minutes and they were musically based. There wasn't much dialogue. I think we were sort of instructed not to do any sort of dialogue or have songs that had words in them. It was strictly sort of instrumental music and creating a movement puppet piece around those. So that was a great challenge too, in figuring out that kind of stuff, sort of on the fly and pretty quickly. And then I think at the time I was there were 28 to 30 students, undergrad and graduate. There were 9 of us who were grad students, and then the rest were undergraduates. And there's a healthy percentage who are still working. Jason Hines and I were there at the same time, and he's now the head builder at the Center for Puppetry Arts, and he's been there, I think, for about 15 years now. And the other graduate students who were there, Deb Hertzberg, and she teaches at Brooklyn College, and Kathy McCullough, who's still a brilliant puppeteer. She does limited work now, but she's really brilliant. Luai Alasaf, who is a Turkish puppeteer. He was sort of the Jim Henson of Turkey. He was there. Kathleen Conroy, she was there. And she was the festival director for the last P of A National in Minnesota. So they were and Hua Zhang was there at the same time too, great Chinese rod puppeteer. So there was a lot of great talent that came through there while I was there in that short time. And yeah, it was really great to be among that pool.
Well, you mentioned the industry, and you actually did do some work on TV. You were the puppeteer for Shades Wolf on the TV show SeeMore's Playhouse. How did you get hooked up with that show?
I had moved to New York in the fall of 2006 and desperately needed a job. And it just so happened that SeeMore's had wrapped their first season and we're going into production for their second season. And Eric Wright, who was a puppeteer for 2 characters, he was a puppeteer for Shades, who was the major character, and then a minor character named Harry Hippo. And Harry was a lot of fun for the writers, and they loved that because he was kind of a doofus, and they loved writing for him. And so he ended up becoming a major character, and Shades was kind of pushed to the background as a minor character. And they needed somebody to take him over so Eric could just focus on Harry. And so Frankie Cordero was the puppet captain, and Frankie and I had known each other for a long time. The first national I went to, the National P of A Festival I went to, was in San Francisco. And Frankie and I were both, along with a marionette artist named Kevin Menegas, we were all 3 chosen by Letty Schubert to be in a young performer workshop. And she was sort of spotlighting young talent in this workshop. And Frankie was there, and I was there, and Kevin was there. And we had sort of stayed in touch, the 3 of us, in random various ways through the years. And Frankie knew I was in New York, and he needed somebody, and he called me up and asked if I would audition for it, and I ended up getting it. And that was, I think we worked 16 weeks. I think it was 16 weeks for that second season. And it was great. That was my real first submersion into television production on that scale, where we were churning out. I think we were doing an episode every 2 to 3 days, I think. And I think it was one of the first shows to utilize green screen, everything. I mean, there was very little that was practical, except the puppets and a few set pieces here and there. But all the backgrounds were green screened, And it was crazy, but it was such a great learning experience, and got to work with Bobby Golden, who was the music director. I don't know. I think a lot of people who grow up enamored of the Muppets look at that Muppets and Men book, and there's a sort of second part of the book where it talks about, now we go record the songs that we're going to do that week, and then here's us performing to the track and all this stuff. So you see that sort of process, but you don't really get a sense of how it works. And then I was suddenly in the midst of it, and it's like, we're going to Bobby's this afternoon and record these songs, and here's the rehearsal track so you can learn the song, and then you go and you do it, and then you sort of put the episode together. And it was just a lot of great work. I got to work with some great people who were used to working with puppets in New York. There was a lot of the crew and team from Between the Lions. There were some Sesame veterans who were around and doing various things other than performing. They were not performers, but some were trying their hat as directors. And it was just a really great sort of intro to this is what it means to be a TV puppeteer. It was sort of real great boot camp.
Well, and then you, after that, you worked on Sesame Street for a while, didn't you?
I worked a season. I did 2 episodes, which totaled 4 days. It was great. I did an Anything Muppet. The first day I was there, I was a green Anything Muppet. That they all sort of, it was confusing because David Rudman was working the same day I was, and so we had 2 Davids. And so they just started calling me and my puppet Stevens. So that's how that's what I was called for the duration of that. And then I did a cow. I had one line, moo. That was the line that I had. So that was my claim to fame there. And man, what an experience. That nothing prepares you for that wonder that is walking onto that set.
Yeah.
The first time I visited a couple of times before I worked there, and it was always the same sort of like, wow, here it is. And because you walk in through the hallway and through those big barn doors, and then there it all is. And then you get down to work, and you're working with some of the most talented people on that side of the camera and on both sides of the camera. And that was a whole thrill. But it's tough, and this because you work in that industry too. It's tough to sort of make the decision as to, is this going to be sustainable? Is there room in this industry? Because it's tight. Like there's not a whole lot of opportunity, and there are a lot of people that it sort of it props up. And so just based on that sort of pragmatism, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to try and keep, to try and keep moving in a direction where I thought it was going to be more.
Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, I totally, every day I'm like, well, is there going to be work after this project? But I think you have a great attitude, and I think we might be, just from the little I know about you and getting to know you, is we might be in the same way. Well, it's like, well, if I'm not going to be able to work on this stuff, I'm going to do my own stuff.
Absolutely. I think that is paramount. In as much as being a performer is about learning how to be a hustle, learning how to hustle to get a gig. It applies to musicians, to puppeteers, to actors, whoever. It's like you have to either figure out how to recontextualize what you do, or you have to figure out some manner of keeping on doing this, especially if you don't have the luxury of a part-time thing that you can just walk in and out of. I have some musician friends who they have a gig that, it's data entry or whatever it is, and they can go and come, and they have a boss who's perfectly flexible with allowing them to work around their performance schedule. And I've never had that. So it's just kind of like it's the real feast or famine. It's like some months are great, and some months go like breathe in a little more, and you understand it too. Like when you work in the industry, it's really good. Like those opportunities are unlike any you'll have anywhere else, and the money tends to be good. And if it's a union gig, you'll get residuals, and they're all sort of perks to working in that world. It's not always that way, but the times it is, it's really good, and it makes you appreciate those if you don't have them on the regular. But you sort of have to be ready for the times that you don't, because it's all over the place. Sometimes it has nothing to do with you. Like it has nothing to do with the performer or the person or anything that you are. It just has to be what they're looking for, or who's around, or who they've seen last, or any number of reasons. And it can be really tough, especially if you feel confident and secure about your own abilities and your talent and all this stuff, and you just, you keep pushing and trying and fighting and all this stuff. But you sort of have to find your own areas in which to work, and whatever that is. If it's doing YouTube videos, if it's doing lives, if it's doing slam pieces, it's whatever you can do to keep it going for yourself.
Well, I want to ask about All Hands Productions, because that is your company, your touring company, and you do workshops and custom puppets and stuff. When did you start All Hands Production, and was there a moment that was like, okay, I got to make this official, I got to set up a company?
I had been doing shows before that under a different name that was sort of, I can't remember what it was. It was something else. But then I knew I needed a better name than the one I had, whatever it was. And when I got out of grad school, that's when I declared All Hands Productions being my company name. And that came from a workshop on business, a business workshop I took at a festival that said you should choose a name with the letter A in it. So if it's ever in the phone book or things are listed alphabetically, you'll come first. And I was like, that's smart. So that's completely why it's not David Stevens Puppets or, the Stevens Puppet Company. That's why it's All Hands Productions. And it sort of was I felt like it was an all-encompassing brand name, too, for stuff that maybe I was doing music or puppets, or if I was doing something else that wasn't puppets, that was still sort of creatively tied to me. It just seemed like a nice umbrella name. So I started that when I got out of grad school in earnest. And but I was doing live shows before that. Like in the summertime when I was in college, I would do library shows, or my productions and that kind of stuff. So I had a healthy sort of client list, if you will, by the time I was ready to start. Mostly summer gigs, and then that just has grown into other stuff. I still have a lot of clients that were around in those days because they're libraries, and libraries are sort of the hot ticket in the summertime if you're a puppeteer or a children's performer. And they've kind of sustained my business all these years. Yeah.
Are you good with the business side of things? Because I know sometimes, like for me, creatively, I'm not. But
no.
Yeah,
no. No. I definitely fall in that camp of artists who are better artists than they are at selling themselves. Man, it is a hard balance to strike, and it is the rare person that is successful at both. My introvertedness wants me to believe that the quality and caliber of my work is going to maintain and propel it. Where it's like, no, sir, you have to be selling the cars. You have to get out on the lot and tell them why they need to buy this thing. And that's just not a muscle I have. And as far as like marketing and cold calling and all that stuff, it's a tough game to play, especially when the model changes all the time. How you sort of try to sell and appeal to, especially like the school market. I mean, I remember having a teacher one time that said, if your material does not have the school board stamp on it, we throw it away immediately. And it's just, well, okay, then it's about meeting the right person, or it's like knowing who can get you somebody on the school board, the PTO, or whatever. I don't know. I was never that good at selling the stuff. The word of mouth has kind of been what I've relied probably too heavily on. I mean, it hasn't allowed me to starve, but it probably has prevented me from doing better than I could be.
Well, is All Hand Productions, is it just you, or do you have a staff or other people you work with?
Just me.
Just
that's the cost efficiency. Occasionally, I've had people in the past do one-off jobs, like Scotty Rowell has been my longtime costumer. He'll costume stuff for me, and that's a flat fee. In the past, long past, I had somebody who was sort of acting as a booking agent for me, and she would take a percentage of the work that came in, which is a great model if you can find somebody that's happy to do it and doesn't want to be salary or doesn't want benefits. And that's kind of rare to find somebody who's willing to generate that kind of work so that it benefits them. That's the impetus, is that the better you do, the better they do. And it's like, I get it. People want guarantees. They want to make a salary. They want to make a certain amount of money. And that's just something I can't guarantee. So it's tough. It's real tough. But I have had people do random various things for me over the years as I need it. But yeah, for the most part, I'm it. I'm the full-time it.
Yeah. The buck stops here.
You got it. And only here. Kind of thankfully only here. I mean, good night. I couldn't imagine like being in an economic pinch and having, mouths that rely on you.
Yeah.
To support. So being this sort of solo puppet company has allowed it to maintain its existence, I think, because it is so small. The landscape changes, and it is changing right now as far as the opportunities that are afforded to people who do live shows. Puppeteers used to tell stories about they would maintain their yearly salary just from doing their own school systems. And that just doesn't exist anymore. Like, it really doesn't. So I have friends who work in the same way I do, and we talk a lot about wondering if we're it, like if we're the last generation to be able to eke out a living doing it the way we've done it. Because we don't know. I mean, maybe something else will come along. I mean, I certainly am a believer that the performing arts are an important, vital part of living. I think we're figuring that out more and more as the days go on here. But I certainly don't think there will be a lack of need for them or a lack of want for them. But it's just a matter of figuring out those opportunities where we can charge a fee for them.
Right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about puppet building, and I'm not going to get into your secrets or anything, but I would love to know, in terms of building a puppet, what, in your opinion, makes an engaging puppet character?
Oh, man, that's sort of a multi-sided die question. I certainly think the way that it looks is important, but then the performance that goes into it is also very important too. And I think they're both reliant on each other. I think that I'm a more informed builder because I'm a performer and vice versa. But yeah, I think it's a cultivated thing where you define what sort of looks right to you. And I think that's really important, that you sort of have a sense of what you think looks right and you think is engaging. Because it's one thing to sort of make something that looks like something else. You can make a Kermit the Frog. Great. Fantastic. I hope you learned how to do a Henson Stitch while you did that. But as far as like generating your own characters and having a sense of style that is your own, now I'm perfectly aware that the style I work in is very Muppet emulative. I got a pass from Jane Henson, so it's okay. But I do think there is enough different about some of what I do that you don't look at it and go, oh, well, that's Ernie or that's Bert or whoever it is. It's like, at least I hope that's the case. I hope people can look at my stuff and say, oh, well, that's a David Stevens, or that looks like something he would do. But that happens over time. I think that's a matter of experimentation and getting a sense of what your aesthetic sense is. And that's not something anybody else can cultivate other than you. And sticking to your guns about it too. I mean, that gets into a whole can of worms about subjective art as far as like design sense and everything else. But there's something that happens when it locks in and it's right, where the character's there because the look of the thing is there. It's built well and it's performed well. And I think building well is about more than just the way that it looks on the outside. I think there is a real skill to making something that's built right on the inside. And you know this. I mean, if you've ever been on that side of the industry and put your hand in something that came out of the Henson shop, you know what built well feels like.
Yeah.
And it's hard to go back. Like, it's hard to go back from anything that came out of that shop, especially if Raleigh built it or Connie Peterson or any of those people who are like gifted builders. Like, they know how to make stuff right from the inside out. And it really makes you appreciate that. Because, you know, there's so many factors that go into it, like how it feels on your hand, but then the weight of it, how light they are, the flexibility of it. I mean, it really is like being able to play a high-end instrument, like a Martin guitar or a Gibson banjo that's been really well crafted so that it plays well and it allows you to play it, like it allows you to get a performance out of it and not just sort of play notes, if that makes sense. That's a musical analogy, but to create that character, it's about so many things. The look, the performance, the whole sort of like combination of all of those things.
Well, how are puppets that are built for a one-person puppet show different from puppets that are built for a show with like multiple performers or a TV show or something?
I think I don't know that my method is so vastly different than building TV puppets. I still have there's not necessarily a necessity to hide seams or anything like that for a live show because if the audience is 7 feet away, they're never going to see them. But I still care about it, like, because I have to look at them. So that's just something that's nitpicky for me. As a solo performer, you know, I don't have. Most of the time I'm operating multiple characters, at least two puppets at one time, usually two puppets at one time because I have two hands. So I don't have the luxury of like utilizing live hand puppets or arm rods most of the time anyway, unless there's a single puppet on stage, which is rare for me. So I have devised, and I can give proper credit now, this was something that was utilized by Bob Brown. I picked it up from Terry, but I never knew where it came from. And I posted something about this, and Bob took the proper credit for it, and I'll shout out to Bob Brown. So I have a method that was his of stringing the puppet's hands to their head. So basically you sort of take a piece of marionette line or braided tie line, and it goes through the hand, sort of where at the base of the thumb. It goes through the hand there and then attaches to around the temple area on the puppet's head. It changes for every puppet because every puppet head is different. But it attaches somewhere on the puppet between the temple and the cheek, or the jawline, up on that upper part of the head. And that allows me to get, and it's strung in such a way so that the hand is kind of around the waist area. If you remember the old Muppet episodes where they would pin the hand to the extra hand to the puppet's waist, and always looked like they were like Napoleon or something where they were cuffing their jacket.
Yeah.
They hang sort of in that area at different levels. So one will be a little higher than the other one. But what that allows is for some motion of the puppet's hands while I'm operating the puppet. Gravity is doing most of the work in that case. But it allows the hands some mobility and some life that they would otherwise be static or just hanging down by their side. So it does give the illusion, at least, that there's some controlled hand motion there, and that there's potentially more than one performer doing all that. You wonder, how are the hands doing that? Because certainly at a distance, you can't see the tie line. You can't see that marionette line. But so that's one trick, and like I said, that was Bob Brown who came up with that idea. And then, yeah, I have utilized that to full maximum capacity.
Well, I will say that part of the reason I asked that question was because when I saw your show at the festival, that was one of the most delightful. I mean, the whole show is great, but as a puppeteer, you're watching something, you're kind of looking at everything from a technical standpoint. That was so delightful to see the hands moving and just be like, okay, there's one puppeteer, but these hands are getting such great movement. And so that's kind of why I asked the question was.
Oh, well, absolutely. I'm glad you did. Yeah, that's certainly one of my little tricks as far as being able to get more than what's perceived out of the puppet. I also like having elements on a puppet, either a costume or part of their I don't want to say. Just part of their overall design, where there's something that has some movement about it, some sympathetic movement, whether it's feathers on their head or some kind of fur, or, like I said, a costume piece that has some sort of inherent sympathetic movement, just something that allows the characters to sort of feel like they're still alive, even if they're not the dominant character talking or having the main action. That there's something still about them that seems alive.
Right. Now, I noticed that a lot of your shows are you've created riffs on fairy tales or folklore. Do you find these stories as good jumping off points to build a show?
Absolutely. I love playing with people's sense of expectation. They think they're getting the story they know, and they're getting something completely different. I mean, that's kind of one of the rules of comedy, right? You playing with expectation. When you expect a certain punchline and you get something completely different, or one you didn't expect. And I love playing with that dynamic. And it's only backfired a couple of times. I remember I was at the puppet. I love this story. I was at the Puppet Showplace Theater doing my Jack and the Beanstalk, which is loose. There's a Jack and a giant, and there's some magic beans, and the rest of it is kind of like, and I was after the show, and I'd gone out into the lobby, and there was a mother out there with her 2 children, and she said, did you do that show that we just saw? And I said, why, yes, I certainly did. And she said, oh, we didn't like it. And I said, oh, no. She said, that wasn't the story. That's not how it goes. And I slunked away back in the theater, like, bye. But for most of the time, I find that audiences play along, like they're in it. Like once you've sort of invited them on this game, and once they're aware of this is the game, they're kind of along for the ride, and have appreciated it. I have tried in the past to stick to the story, and it's just so boring to me. I lose so much interest because it's like, that's the way it always goes.
Yeah. And
I just kind of want to play with the variables and see what happens. I love the theater. I think it was Stanislavski, the magic what if. I love that device as a game to sort of like jump off from, like, okay, well, let's say we have a kid named Jack, and what if he has a dog instead of a cow? And what if there's an old hag who turns him into a frog? And it's kind of all those like questions that build off of what if. And it just, for me, it seems like a richer way for me to tell a story than just hearing the story that you always know. Now, some people like that. There's something there's some comfort in hearing the story the way you always know it. And, I love this story and I want to share it with my children or my grandchildren, and which is fine. That's great. And you can tell them that story. There's nothing preventing you from telling them that story that way. But I find that for me to have my stamp on it, it really has to kind of be wackadoo.
Well, how long does it take, and this could be different for each show, but in ballpark, how long does it take to develop a show?
It depends on how well formed it is in my head before I want to attack it. Billy Goat Scruff and other stuff sort of came out in 2 months. Like, it was from the time it was conceived until its first performance was about 2 months. But that was, years ago. I mean, that was 2000, 20 years ago. The most recent show I did, The Pied Picker, that was about I guess it was about a year that I applied for a Jim Henson Foundation grant and got a family funded a family grant for funds to produce that show. And because of a previous grant I had gotten through them, the first one I got was for The Reluctant Dragon. And this was before they had set a time limit on using the funds. And because I drug my heels so long in like birthing that show because it just wouldn't come, because of that, they now have a time restriction that you have to complete the grant within the grant cycle. Rightfully so. That was and that actually worked for me for Pied Picker because I needed the deadline. It really did light a fire under me to get it finished. It takes me a long time to figure out how to scramble the Rubik's Cube. And I'll explain. So if you think of like the story as a finished Rubik's Cube of whatever fairy tale it happens to be, and my job or what I feel like my way of telling a story is just to scramble it up, it's taken me a long time now to figure out how I want to unscramble it, and to figure out what's an interesting way of unscrambling that story or scrambling it to make it engaging and still a story I want to tell. That seems to be a harder muscle for me to flex now, because I don't want to repeat or I second guess stuff. It's all of that solo artist stuff that we do where we second guess our abilities. We second guess the validity of an idea we've had. I mean, it's all that stuff where you sort of belittle yourself into thinking it's rotten until you figure out the right way to tell it, until you feel like you've got a winner. Right. That sounds like a lousy way to say it. But for me, these shows kind of develop like a piece of music. Like they have a rhythm to them. And they don't feel done until they lock into their rhythm. And sometimes that happens after they've been performed for a while. Pied Picker, even when I was doing that show at the festival, I changed some stuff right before I did those shows. Because it just was not feeling right. It wasn't locking in the way that I wanted it to. And sometimes that takes a bit of doing. And it seemed to be a little easier earlier on than it does now. But I guess that's part of the process. That's what it means to be an artist. Is sometimes that critical eye can be your worst enemy as much as it can be your best friend.
Well, you mentioned music, and I know that you are a musician. You have several albums out and stuff. Do you create all the music for your shows?
I do, yeah. And that's a real fun sort of added benefit thing, too, is to have a little sort of setup. Because in my Gingerbread Man show and Billy Goat Scruff, a lot of those shows start out with an introductory song. And really, it's just sort of, it's a meeting of the audience. It's kind of an establishment of like, you're there and I'm here and I'm doing this thing and you're here to watch this thing and we're going to have a good time in this next 45 minutes kind of the establishment. So it's not just clickety way right into the puppet show. But yeah, and I do enjoy that because it's also a different flavor, because not every puppet show you're going to go to is going to have a banjo player, or should it? But it's just a little different flavor that adds to it. And most of the time I find the note I get is like people want more banjo. So it's like, well, all right, if I could figure out a way to do both of them, I would. Yeah.
I'm in the more banjo camp myself, personally.
Well, I did, for those the festival show, there was only banjo before those shows. There was only banjo at the beginning of Pied Picker. Like it was strictly an introduction to get into. So in my version of the Pied Picker, which is a retelling of the Pied Piper, instead of rats, there are roaches. And the introductory device of the puppets is I come out playing the banjo, and there's a roach puppet that's hidden inside the pot of the banjo. And he comes out and sort of interrupts me. So I don't even get through the whole song at the beginning of the show. And so that was kind of it for a long time. And then I kept consistently getting this people wanting more banjo. And then I decided to tack it on at the end. I come out at the end and sort of wrap it up with a banjo verse or two. And that was strictly to appease people that were upset that there wasn't more banjo.
I read an interview you did where you were asked if you were an activist or you try to get any sort of message across on your show, and you answered that you just wanted your shows to be pure entertainment. Is that still true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've never felt like an effective didactic puppeteer in the times that I've tried it, which have been very limited. I don't know. It rings hollow to me. Just because I myself am not an activist of any real kind. I have beliefs about things. I'm, politically thinking or whatever, which doesn't weigh on anything. But it's never been an extension of my work the way it is for puppeteers like Peter Schumann or any of that camp, who really the puppetry is an extension of the message they're trying to get across. And I've never felt like I was that sort of puppeteer. If anything, I want this to be a unifying experience. Because, and I'll tell you this story too. So when I first trotted out Billy Goat Scruff and Other Stuff, it wasn't Billy Goat Scruff and Other Stuff. Billy Goat wasn't in the show. I had a shadow puppet sequence in it that I had developed when I was at University of Connecticut. And it was an old folk song, centuries old folk song about the devil and the farmer's wife. And, the story goes that the devil comes up to this farmer and he takes his wife down to, Hades, and she wreaks such havoc down there, the devil brings her back. I mean, it's a hilarious song, but I tried to do that piece in South Alabama. And the librarian came. I had 3 days, 5 shows in this library branch. And she came up to me and she said, "We need to talk." And I said, "About what?" And she said, "You know that whole thing with the devil?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "You have to take that out." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Yeah, as soon as that devil puppet popped up on the screen, we had 3 families get up and leave." Oh, crap. I hadn't even thought of it. And it was, I had to realize the difference between a person visualizing something on their own and being presented with a visual, the difference in power that has. Whereas if you sing a song, you're sitting there and maybe you're imagining the story. If you're a visual thinker like I am, you're picturing it in your head. But if you are given a picture, then you are suddenly told what to see. And that was a very valuable lesson. But it also taught me that you don't know who's in your audience. Mm-hmm. And you have to sort of take that into account. And a lot of people who work in theater use theater as a tool to expand thought and to challenge thought and to create a space wherein people can have a debate or a discussion about those things. But it's a different beast when you get into the realm of children's theater. When you are exposing someone's children or grandchildren to something, you really have to be careful about that, I think. So I like creating a space where it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter what walk of life you are. It doesn't matter any of that. You can come to my show, and I'm not going to push your buttons. It's like the only button I'm going to push is hopefully a laughter button or a button of enjoyment. I want people to have a good time at the shows, and I hope they walk away with maybe more of an appreciation for the art of puppetry. But I'm not trying to teach them to stay away from drugs. I'm not trying to teach them to do anything other than here is a safe space. I hate that word, but here is a space where you can not worry that somebody's going to try and push something down your throat.
I love it. I absolutely love it. I have a couple more questions here as we wrap up. You mentioned Jane Henson earlier, and I know you spent some time with Jane, and I would love to know your thoughts on how important she was to the world of puppetry.
She did not get near the credit she deserved. Jane was such an integral part to the early years of the Muppets, and I'm glad that she created the Henson legacy. I am glad she did a lot of the work that she did toward the end of her life, because I think it allowed her to take some credit for some of what she contributed to, which was a lot. I don't think a lot of people know that when people would audition or train for Muppets, they were training with Jane. Like it was Jane that taught Frank Oz how to manipulate Muppet-style puppets, because Jim was running a company and he was doing other stuff. So Jane was really a stalwart figure in the Muppets being the success that they were, especially in the early years. So I'm really glad that she did a lot of that preservation work later on, just to sort of cement her own significance in the work that was done. And she did a lot. Like, the reason that there are puppets in the Smithsonian, the reason there are puppets at MOMI and at the Center for Puppetry Arts is because of Jane. It's because Jane had enough wherewithal to sort of say, this stuff needs to be preserved somewhere, and it needs to be kept somewhere, and people need to see it so that Jim's legacy stays alive, and by extension, her own. Sadly, I think she's easy to overlook if you aren't looking for her or know to look for her. But she's right there. And a lot of that stuff, I mean, you think about the early Sam and Friends stuff where it's Harry and Kermit singing Old Black Magic. That's Jane doing Kermit. Jim's the one going nuts with Harry in the background, but that's Jane doing Kermit. And she did a lot of that stuff, and just so subtle. So one of the Jim Henson's Fantastic World, which was an extension of a Smithsonian exhibit, was traveling around the country, and it came to Atlanta, and it was at the Atlanta History Center, and they asked if the center was sort of partnering, the Center for Puppetry Arts was partnering with the Atlanta History Center for that exhibit, and I was asked if I would do a demonstration of camera puppetry. And I said, sure. So they supplied the camera, and I brought some puppets, and I laid them out on a table. And, well, I didn't know that Jane and Arthur Novell, who worked with the Legacy, and Karen Falk, who was the Henson archivist, were all going to be there. I had no idea. And so they had some volunteers from the Atlanta History Center and some puppet people and some Muppet fans and stuff. And I was trying to demonstrate camera puppetry, and I was trying to get volunteers to come up and just goof around on camera. And nobody was going up there. And Jane sort of stepped forward, and she came to the table, and she asked me, okay, which one am I? And I said, well, you're whichever one you want, Jane. And she picked up this purple character of mine named Norbert, and we went over to the camera, and I'll never forget Arthur and Karen just sort of standing off at a distance with their mouths hanging open, and we just goofed around on camera, and she didn't lose. She hadn't lost it. Like, she was still just a great manipulator. Just subtle and understated, but solid. I mean, she didn't have to bounce around and do a whole lot of eccentric movement to attract herself. It was there, and I'll never forget. It was at Jane's funeral. Karen Falk came up to me and she said, we had breakfast that next morning after that, and they said we were talking about it, and Karen asked her if she had fun goofing around on the camera. And Jane told her, she said, after that experience, if I had to go back and do it all again, I'd do it the same way. And that meant a lot to me. I mean, in one fell statement, it was just kind of like, whoa, I was not prepared for that. But we had a real fondness for one another, and she was a special lady to me. And we always had a good time. We always had a great time when we got together because we'd laugh a lot. And, we were real simpatico. She could be a real intimidating figure to a lot of people, especially if you worked in a Muppet style. Because, boy, she could be tough. She did not condone easily those who emulated the Muppet way of puppetry. And I was very nervous when I knew Jane was going to be in one of my audiences because I had no idea what she was going to think of it or what her opinion was going to be. Because if you came down on the wrong side, that was kind of it. There was sort of no getting on the right side. No matter what you did or how nice you tried to be or anything else, her mind, you'd been judged. So I felt very fortunate that she liked my work and that we got along.
Well, David, what has been the highlight of your career so far?
Oh man, that's a hard one to answer. I mean, because I've kind of gotten to do, if I'm sitting here in this moment reflecting on it, I've kind of gotten to do what I wanted to do in this world. I've gotten to do the live shows. I've created original work. I've created original characters that are extensions of myself. I've been hosted by prestigious organizations in the field of puppetry, like the Center for Puppetry Arts and Puppeteers of America. I've been lucky to get a couple of Unima citations, which are a real honor and a treasure. It means a lot when your peers pat you on the back. That means a tremendous amount. And it also means a lot to have worked on the industry side of things too, because that was definitely a real childhood dream. And to have met heroes that I knew when I was, that I made when I was a kid, to know Jerry and Jane and to know a lot of that older guard. I mean, if I had a highlight, it's kind of been the whole thing.
I can see that. Well, if folks want to get in touch with you online, where can they do so?
Well, I have a website at allhandsproductions.com. That's hands plural, productions plural, so allhandsproductions.com. All Hands has a Facebook page that I try to keep up to date. I have a personal Facebook page there too. And then I have an Instagram account, which is All Hands Productions, and it's sort of filled with all kinds of things, drawings and banjos and puppets and pets and whatever. So those are sort of the key ways to get a hold of me. I have a very outdated blog called Puppets and Banjos. I think it's still around.
It is, because I went through it to get some of the questions for this interview. So,
like I said, it's very outdated, but some of the stuff that's there is still pretty fun.
Well, David, I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me today, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thanks for the great questions, Grant. It was great to talk to you.
Many thanks to David Stevens for being on this episode of the show. For links to All Hands Productions, as well as to some of the things David and I discussed, check out the show notes for this episode number 41, over at underthepuppet.com. Well, now it's time to announce the winner of episode 39's giveaway for an autographed copy of the book Making Puppets the Fairyland Way, signed by author Randall J. Metz. The question was, on the TV show Pinwheel, what was the Hobo bug's hair made out of? And the correct answer is fiber optics. And the winner is Jason Miller. Congratulations, Jason. Your copy of Making Puppets the Fairyland Way is on its way to you. Thank you so much to everyone who entered. Well, now it's time for this episode's giveaway, and it is for a totally awesome Funko Pop of Sesame Street's Count Von Count, autographed by the Count and puppeteer Matt Vogel. I can't begin to count the number of ways this prize is cool, but it can be yours if you can answer this question from the episode you just listened to. David's show Pied Picker is based on the tale of the Pied Piper. What creatures take the place of the rats in David's story? When you find the answer, send it in an email to underthepuppet@gmail.com with the subject line giveaway, and you'll be entered to win. All entries for this giveaway must be received by April 15th, 2020. The winner will be chosen at random from all correct entries and be announced on the May 1st, 2020 episode of the show. Good luck! Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Under the Puppet. If you have feedback, you can send it via email to underthepuppet@gmail.com, or you can connect with the show on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram by searching for Under the Puppet. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you next time. This episode of Under the Puppet featured music by Dan Ring and was edited by Steven Staver. Under the Puppet is a production of Saturday Morning Media and made possible by the Saturday Morning Media Patreon patrons who've gone to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up a monthly pledge for as little as $1 a month. Patrons get new episodes before they are released, behind-the-scenes information, and exclusive bonus episodes. If you'd like to support this show and the other fun content from Saturday Morning Media, become a patron. Head on over to patreon.com/Saturday Morning Media and set up your monthly pledge today. You can also tell a friend about the show or leave the show a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. Under the Puppet is copyright 2020 Saturday Morning Media, Grant Bachogo executive producer, all rights reserved. www.SaturdayMorningMedia.com. The new Under the Puppet app is here for iOS and Android, and it is absolutely free. Download it today to get all the episodes of Under the Puppet in one place. Plus, you'll hear new episodes before their release, get exclusive bonus episodes, and more. Just search for Under the Puppet in the Apple App Store for iOS or on Google Play. You can also visit SaturdayMorningMedia.com/apps for direct links. The free Under the Puppet app for iOS and Android. Download it today.
You've been listening to Saturday Morning Media. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.